Hello there. The following review will be incredibly ugly, as the new copyright system YouTube implemented on the 30th of March 2021 meant uploading this without completely butchering it was an impossibility. After 6 attempts at uploading it in various states of undress, I've realized that the only way to sneak past the censors is by slapping a big translucent image over the top of the entire thing, and I am deeply sorry for the inconvenience. Whilst I'm at it, I'll also mention that this review does contain spoilers for both Dawn of the Deep Soul and the first season of the show. Thanks for bearing with me. Well, here we are again. Suicide spelunking was never one of my favourite pastimes, but once more we find ourselves headed back into the abyss, and once more I find myself wincing in second-hand pain as our long-suffering protagonists are yet again confronted with the chilling darkness within the hearts of man and what it truly means to live and to die, and all those other fun lessons we teach children today. I don't know why I do this, gang. I'm fully aware that this kind of thing gets to me terribly easily, and it was with no small amount of dread that I plonked myself down in front of my computer to watch the suffering continue, taking a friend with me for much the same reason that homicide detectives usually work in pairs. I braced as one might upon realizing the aeroplane they're in is starting to nosedive, because this was not something I wanted to watch. Not least because I was pretty legitimately shaken by episode 10 of the original series, and any series that's willing to show a relatively graphic close-up of a child's arm being crushed with a rock is a series that does not do things by halves. Not to get ahead of myself, but this turned out to be an appropriate response. There's a certain draw to Made in Abyss that's as horrible as it is intriguing, I feel, which is fitting since that's the thrust of the character motivations as well. For those of you who haven't watched my review of the original series, it's right here, but since we all live mile-a-minute lives, allow me to briefly waste yours by summarizing the plot thus far. The titular abyss is a colossal hole not dissimilar to the level of the same name in Wario Land 3, and much like that level, it contains mysterious supernatural treasures from some unknown ancient civilization. As such, people essentially tomb raid the thing to such an intense degree that it's both a tourist attraction in the city that has been built up around the mouth of the cave, and it's also what children growing up in said city learn about in school, as opposed to how to ensure a prolonged lifespan. Our protagonist Rico gets a letter from her mother saying that she made it to the bottom layer of the abyss and wants Rico to join her down there, and after finding a cool and strong robot called Reg, Rico decides that there has never been a better time than now to recklessly throw her life away and starts her adventure into the pit where things always go wrong all the time and from which there is no return, very much like Liverpool. They've since bumped into Nanachi, who saved them after a particularly vicious encounter in the 4th layer during an arc whose emotional intensity was only rivaled by my sense of utter horror at what I was witnessing, because that's what happens. Throughout the first season of the series, we hear fairly frequent mention of a nightmare man called Bondrude who's lived down in the abyss for a very long time. We know he's responsible for what happened to Nanachi and Mitty, and we know he's feared, and we know he's dangerous, and now Reg, Rico, and Nanachi are paying him a house call Begin Trauma. I feel like the first thing I need to do when getting into the review of Dawn of the Deep Soul proper is to point out that this is, as it's quite possible you've intuited from my expression of sentiments like breaking a child's arm with a rock and inevitable demise thus far, a rather grisly film. It's so much more than that, of course, but out of consideration for those watching at home who trend towards the squeamish side, as indeed I myself do, this film contains some fine examples of desperately unpleasant subject matter. Please exercise caution, because whilst I'd like to say that this shouldn't be quite as hard to watch as some of the most unpalatable moments of the 12-episode series that preceded it, it is still Made in Abyss, and the word abyss is a synonym for hell for a reason. But yes, it's important to get this out of the way. This is, more so than the usual shows I cover at least, a supremely disconcerting film. We're talking vivisections, body horror to the nth degree, a lot of very disturbing stuff to do with the grotesque masses of tissue, bone, and self-destructive impulses that we, terrifyingly, consist of. You expect the animators, thoughtful fellows that they are, to cut away from something like random example, a botched amputation, for the same reasons why medical procedurals rarely show actual medical procedure. The moment one realizes they're genuinely really going to show you Reg's flailing attempts to sever one of Rico's arms in exacting detail, which I refrain from showing here, mostly just so I don't have to look at it again, is the moment one realizes that all bets are now officially off. The show has handed you a card saying it won't be pulling its punches, meaning that the whole series is going to be a minefield from here on out, and it largely stays true to that. Another thing I do want to briefly mention, because I've been struggling to work it into the narrative of this review to no avail and thus must hammer it in at a random spot, once more we see the child protagonists of this cursed, miserable show lose control of their bladder due to extreme physical duress. And according to the scholarly works of eminent scientist and world leader Ian Fleming, we've now reached the bare minimum for what can be considered a pattern. For all my thesauruses, thesauri, I still don't know how to broach that aspect of the series. It's gross, that much is very true, and it's terrible that I need to consistently put a huge asterisk over any recommendations I give for this series as a result, certainly. We can give them the benefit of the doubt and assume the author is using it as a visual device to let us know the extent of the pain they're suffering and give the proceedings a layer of realism. God knows how well it worked in Metal Gear Solid when Otacon violently realized that anime was real, but it's still happening a bit too often for my liking, is all, i.e., more than 0 times. They kind of take it to the next level with this one too. I'm not a fan of the fact that they dwell on Reg getting a boner every time he fluffs Nanachi, for example. It's arguable if they've crossed a line or not, an argument I don't want to have, but if they haven't, you can see the line from here. I mean, good lord, what will the furries take from us next? Our very lives? But despite all the preamble, there is a gem of a film in here. Immediately, Dawn of the Deep Soul reminds us of traumas past by starting us in the same area in which Rico enjoyed that attempted 127 hours style amputation, which put me right back into fight or flight mode, but I would be lying if I said the opening of this film especially, however grim, isn't anything short of masterful. It's an exquisite reminder of the tone that is so utterly instrumental to how Made in Abyss feels. It's something so specifically unique to this series. Out of all the media I've consumed, that I can recall is how it plays with a singular entity being possessed of completely antithetical attributes and have them work concurrently to create an unerring, vague sense of incorrectness. More than ever before, the Abyss is a world of horrifying antitheses operating in tandem, and the illogical nature of the inherent contradictions that calls it all to feel like it's an utterly broken world. It's wrong. On the most fundamental level, everything down there is wrong. Beauty and death aren't just intertwined, they're inherently inseparable. In the Abyss, they exist simultaneously. The field of flowers Rico's mother loved is a graveyard and a parasitic creature's nest, both. The corpses laugh as the insects that killed them climb into their mouths to feed them and keep them alive. The great misshapen monster speaks in a calm, gentle voice as he pulls out a flamethrower and recites the progression of infestation. Incomprehensible, wrong, it's terrible. But it's got an irresistible allure to it, ethereal, esoteric, like walking through a dream and realizing you're not the one dreaming it. This sense of fundamental wrongness permeates the entire film, and it's so fantastic to see that the tone is consistent with the show's original run. Hell, I say consistent, I should say this is a much more distilled example of it. It's raw, unfiltered wrong, smuggled in by some peculiarly accented southerners under cover of darkness because the local wrong isn't potent enough. Of course, one of the primary players in both the effectiveness of the opening scene and the series in general has always been Kevin Penkin's absolutely wonderful score right from that first scene. Abyss has a way of smothering you with its atmosphere to the point of claustrophobia. This series wouldn't be half of what it is without this soundtrack. It just overwhelms you completely. Subjective as it may be, as with the objectively perfect Hanezeva Karadina before it, particular merit has to be given to one of the standouts from the score, Prayer and Immolation, which made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when it first swung into action. Right out of the gate, it hit me once again that despite my misgivings, I do very much enjoy Made in Abyss for a very specific, very standout reason. More than just the score being potent, of course, is the fact that they know when to use it and, more importantly, when not to. The amount of restraint that was shown in the usage of the OST here shows that the team at Kinema Citrus understand how to make the very specific atmosphere of this hellhole sing. And hell, they even reflect the whole opposites operating in concert with one another to a very literal conclusion in its soundtrack, where quiet, peaceful violin is coupled with wild, blaring industrial synth. The Abyss is an enigmatic, mysterious hell that we feel compelled to understand, even knowing that the answer to the questions being posed will, in all likelihood, be unpleasant ones. It's almost Lovecraftian in a sense, an eldritch oppressive mystery where our desire to know is only matched by our understanding that whatever we find out will probably leave us worse off for it. Nowhere though in either the film or the series that preceded it is this concept of utter antithesis existing simultaneously in a single entity better exemplified than in the antagonist of this particular adventure, Bondrude. We all knew he was coming, of course, very much like sitting in the dentist's office waiting for a root canal, but I don't think anyone was quite prepared for how hard he would hit when he landed. Never before has a character from Destiny had such an imposing presence in the first 5 seconds of encountering them, and whilst there's a great deal of that is of course owed to the sound design and how he's been built up and with what we know he's capable of thanks to Nanachi and Mitty, the first real encounter with Bondrude feels genuinely sinister despite him not doing anything to specifically invite distrust in that moment. It's easy to have unflappable monotone villains like myself run out their welcome quickly, but Bondrude is so clinically insane yet so completely calm and in control that he really just dominates the screen when he's in view. Does he love Prushka? Does he view her as a tool? Does he care about Nanachi? He's utterly sincere but also utterly insane, and he's impossible to read as a result. When things go downhill, as of course they must, Bondrude never shows an ounce of aggression towards his would-be antagonizers. When Nanachi begs Bondrude not to do anything to Reg and Rico and his response is, "Oh, that's a problem," you get the very real sense that he did not anticipate Nanachi might not want Rico and Reg harmed, and that Bondrude actually does regret doing something that would upset Nanachi, but it's equally possible that he genuinely doesn't care at all and that it's all lip service. He's emotionally passive whilst being the driving force of the entire arc in this film, and he does embody that concept of complete opposites existing in tandem. He remembers the names of every child he's killed, but he did kill them anyway. His strength as an antagonist is remarkable. And thus we get to the real tragedy of Made in Abyss, is precisely that it is all wrong. We see constant flashes of the life that could have been in between the nightmare, of the relationship that could have been between Prushka and Bondrude, of the life that could have awaited all of them if the Abyss hadn't gotten its claws into them all. Once again they affirm, as in all great psychological horror, that the real villain in the series isn't the monsters that stand in the way of our protagonists, but the very world around them. All the things that have gone wrong so arbitrarily, and it's a heartbreaking tragedy on top of being a hugely compelling, gripping horror thriller. The Abyss is an absolutely liminal place in that it is never just one thing. Nothing is straightforward down there. It's a beautiful field of flowers, it's a nest of horrible parasitic insects. He's a caring father, he's an insane mad scientist. He is the Abyss made manifest, and he's a walking nightmare precisely because he doesn't think there's anything wrong with himself. I suppose this is best summed up by my closing thoughts when I had finished watching it for the first time. I was utterly transfixed whilst watching Dawn of the Deep Soul. I never want to watch Dawn of the Deep Soul ever again. That is, of course, a desire that will unfortunately go unfulfilled, as I will eventually have to edit the video that you are currently watching. Such is life. Ultimately, the most important goal of a review is to say whether or not the schmuck in question recommends it. Do I recommend it? Christ, that's a good question. I'll try and answer that in the way that seems most appropriate for a series like this. I don't think you should watch this as soon as you possibly can, because I would be hard-pressed to say I enjoyed watching this, but you know, sometimes life isn't fun. It can't all be games, gotta have a hard drive malfunction in there somewhere. Usually, I'm a pretty cold-hearted individual when it comes to dropping things I'm not enjoying. For example, I attempted to watch Dorohedoro on a friend's recommendation and jumped out after the first episode because it was very unpleasant, weird and gross, and this is apparently the reason why it is good. But when the little girl got her face shredded off by the lizard man's teeth and lay screaming in anguish on the floor as we see the torn skin hanging off the protagonist's teeth and he casually shrugs it off, I realized that I absolutely hated it. Comparatively, Deep Souls horror is a lot more psychological, a lot more reflective. It's less seeing the process and more seeing the result and knowing what happened to bring that result about. That's not to say it doesn't show some things, as indeed it does, enough to turn a stomach, but it's not as bad as episode 10, certainly. It's flashes of terror presented in between a slideshow of paternal bonding. Made in Abyss inhabits an odd borderland between a dream and a nightmare. It's fuzzy, distorted, it's not transitional either. It's at the same time fully one and fully the other. I hope you're not getting sick of me saying it's one thing and then saying it's also the complete opposite of that thing, because I certainly am. There's no happy ending that isn't tainted by the tragedy. There's no resolution. Reg, Rico, and Nanachi pick up the broken pieces, glue them together as best they can, and move onwards into greater danger, and they don't really have a choice anymore too. This is officially the point of no return. It's one of those messages that finds a sort of reluctant hope in fatalism, that we will lose people we love along the way, that bad things will happen, that the darkness will only get deeper, but the adventure must continue for as long as we're able to see it through. It's by turns beautiful and abhorrent, touching and horrifying, mesmerizing and repulsive. I found myself watching this film off, knowing it would be a rough ride for me, and at the same time I couldn't stop myself from eventually watching it anyway. The feeling you get when you finish watching Made in Abyss is very unique. It's like a sort of... it's not bittersweet, it's too depressing and macabre for that. It's like a grim determination or something of the sort. It's only going to get worse, but we have to keep going and make the best of it. Not that I want to glorify anything a certain prime minister allegedly said, but if you're going through hell, keep going, is a fairly poignant, not to mention potent, message for the times in which we find ourselves. I really should have been doing this for as long as they've been supporting me, but I cannot thank my patrons enough for being willing to support my utterly insane upload schedule. Their patience is a blessing I don't deserve, and as such, I'd like to thank all of the names on the screen here for bearing with me, and you all for watching. Have an absolutely wonderful day, everyone.